National polls have continued to show a wide lead for Joe Biden over President Trump. But does President Trump actually still have a pretty good chance of getting back in and winning this election? The Bulwark is arguing in a new article that Trump has a shot depending on Biden's debate performances, his VP pick, and his convention turnout. And new polls suggest that Trump remains in striking distance of Biden, with a Monmouth University poll showing Trump at 48% support in Iowa compared to Biden's 45%.
Joining us now to discuss Trump's chances are Democratic strategist and principal with the Rabin Group, Estuardo Rodriguez, and co-host of the Realignment podcast with our buddy Sagar, Marshall Kosloff.
So great to see you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for the invite.
So I saw this piece in CNN yesterday. Harry Enton, who's like their data guy, their Nate Silver version over there, he went through the numbers and said, look, yes, Biden still holds a pretty sizable national lead. He still holds an edge in most of the swing states. But what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is at least a stabilizing for Trump and potentially even a little bit of a few point closing of the gap nationally. So, Estuardo, let me start with you. We haven't talked to you for a while. Give us kind of your assessment of the state of the race and how well positioned Biden is, whether Trump has a chance at making a comeback here.
Absolutely. Well, I would imagine that I'm not the only one in this group that still has scars from polling from 2016. I'm not one to jump up and down on any positive polling for Biden or polling that shows that it's a close race. I'm going to be consistent about the fact that it's still over 80 days out. Polling's going to change. Whether there are any flubs from Trump, I think he's impervious to that. Probably what would change the polling at all is any mistakes that Biden makes over any mistakes that Trump makes, because Trump has made so many mistakes up to this point, and nothing has really changed in terms of the base of supporters he has. That he's in striking distance is not a surprise at all. And if there's a poll next week that shows that he's far behind Biden, I'm going to gamble that there's still always going to be that Trump voter. It's not going to participate in polling. It's what happened in 2016. A Trump supporter who just simply stayed away from it, or when polled, simply didn't want to admit they were supporting Trump. So it's going to be a race that Biden's going to consistently run as one where he is behind. That's the lesson learned from what happened in 2016. And anything different from that, or any overconfidence from Biden's campaign, is going to surely ruin his chances from getting into the White House.
Marshall, I'm curious, as we talk about all these conversations, I think a lot of people might sit back and wonder, in this environment, what it is that would still have voters supporting President Trump. From your perspective, what are those things that keep people clinging to Donald Trump? And are we seeing some of those indications that retrospectively we saw in 2016 that the polls were not capturing Trump's support? So on those two questions, what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, from my perspective, it's the culture wars, right? Like, the issue that you're going into here is that there's a large number of voters who are going to be with President Trump no matter what. Same is true of Joe Biden in their own context. I think people in both parties are going to see every single political debate that we're having right now as existential for their issue. So if you're a conservative voter who's voting on judges, now the recent track record on that isn't that great, but let's say you're obviously not going to switch from that. And that's why I think the key phrase in the story that Crystal introduced is stabilized. President Trump has a stable base where you're just not going to see polls continue to decline from. So that's the recurrent thing. There's just, I think, 40% of the electorate on both sides of the aisle, but it's basically going to be unswingable when you look at these big issues.
And Marshall, I do think that is different from some of the indications that we were seeing. I mean, the landscape, it's just like how hard to wrap your head around how different a place we're in now versus 2016 in terms of a pandemic, in terms of national unrest, in terms of, look, congressional negotiators have basically given up on a new stimulus package here this week, leaving potentially millions of Americans facing homelessness, facing hunger, facing insecurity in all aspects of their life without jobs. So we see that there's I think the number was 13% or 18% of Americans who say they're satisfied with the direction. The economy continues to be in for that V-shaped recovery is, long gone in fantasy land thinking. Do these things ultimately, are they just too much to overcome, right? Where the presidential race in some ways has been sort of irrelevant. Biden has certainly been irrelevant, but Trump, in terms of what his campaign is doing is also sort of irrelevant. It actually comes down to being able to govern, get the pandemic under control, provide people economic relief. And if you can't do that, can you possibly overcome these unbelievable forces arrayed against you?
Yeah, and what's the story since 2008 during the financial crisis? Change candidates are the ones who win. Obama in 2008 is a change candidate. Mitt Romney is in 2012 is basically running as sort of the Bush-era GOP establishment. President Trump in 2016 was also the change candidate. So what's been so terrible for the Trump administration and the Trump reelection campaign is that Joe Biden, who spent 40 plus 50 years in American politics, has enabled himself to become the change candidate. And that's what I just don't see the Trump administration able to sort of overcome here. I don't think President Trump is suited for being the governing candidate, for being the person who's sort of caught holding the bag during this actual race here. So that's the big issue, but I just don't see how they're going to be able to overcome that.
Yeah.
Estuardo, I'm curious if, from your perspective, if Democrats appear to be learning some of those lessons of 2016 right now. I mean, it's already August, and we're seeing, we talked about this on the show yesterday, the Biden campaign start considering spending in states like Ohio, in Texas, and Arizona, maybe in Florida, those areas. Do you think that there's a confidence that's coming with these big polling leads on the Biden side? And in general, do you just think that Democrats have learned their lessons of 2016 and are better able to communicate with some of those persuadable voters in the middle?
Well, you've also seen a growing change in the demographic in some of these key states, especially Florida, as a greater and greater amounts of the Puerto Rican community have left the island and moved and expanded across Central Florida. There's a great effort in making sure that there's money and boots on the ground, even though there's social distancing, but still connecting with folks across Central Florida is going to be key. It was closer than people expected in 2016 in terms of the state numbers and the turnout. So I think we're going to see Biden continue to spend money in states where in 2016 Hillary did not. That's exactly what he needs to do. But I think more importantly, expanding the surrogates that they have. I mean, we saw the announcement yesterday of Ana Navarro, Republican conservative from Florida, who has consistently been beating the drum that we have to get Donald Trump out of the White House. She brings with her credibility around the conversations that conservatives are having. And I think expanding that pool of surrogates is going to be important for him across some of these key states, as well as doubling down on the money, while looking at some states like my state of Virginia, where there's a greater confidence that Virginia may likely stay blue thanks to Northern Virginia. There's going to be some diverting of funds to other states that are closer and leaning more red.
Marshall, what are the events that could occur between now and Election Day? The president's thrown out there, we're going to have a vaccine right around Election Day, right? Clearly, they're trying to gin up some kind of October or November surprise, although, people are voting a lot earlier in a lot larger numbers, probably this election, than they ever have before. But what are some of those events that could occur between now and then that could flip this thing around for them?
Those Comey events.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of the tough thing, which is because it feels like nothing's happening, it's hard to see what broader, what specific Comey type events would have sort of happen here. I think what could happen, though, is economic stimulus. I think aggressive leadership on this sort of issue. I don't basically agree with anything sort of David Frum says on his politics. We had this sort of good metaphor he was talking about when Herbert Hoover was trying to win during the Great Depression. He was known as this president who was working 18-hour days trying to focus on these issues. So I think what could happen is if there's a world where President Trump could get his act together and spend the next 2 months working on the economic stimulus, working exclusively on the school reopening issues, and just being hyper-focused and working to restore his credibility among those moderate suburban swing voters who, frankly, Joe Biden is really cleaning up with, that's what you're going to sort of need to see happen. I think thinking about this in terms of just events that need to happen is sort of missing it, because what you really need is a broader shift in the environment that's going to have to be sustained for more than just sort of one instance. It's not going to be a speech. It's not going to be a drop. It's not going to be a vaccine. It has to be a longer sustained effort.
Yeah, it's not going to be like, oh my God, he wore a mask one day. Marshall and Estuardo, stick with us. We're going to have more with Team Rising when Rising returns.